Thank you, Mrs. Moon. It was a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, however briefly, and it is a great pleasure to serve under yours, Mr. Davis. I beg to move that this House has considered the Russian annexation of Crimea. The 18th of March 2019 was the 5th anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea. It's just worth stopping at this point to dwell on the fact that Russia has been allowed to annex Crimea for 5 years and to carry out military activities in the Donbass, and also to have invaded 2 enclaves of Georgia. We are dealing with a serial offender here, as I said in my speech in this chamber in July last year. I'm going to look at first what happened 5 years ago, then I'm going to move on to the impact of the illegal annexation, and then finally to look at the current situation in the Azov Sea. On February the 20th, 2014, Russia's little green men, as they are called, that is military without insignia, started the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula. This began the process of annexation as soldiers wearing Russian combat fatigues and carrying Russian weapons began seizing important institutions in the peninsula. Russia initially denied that they were Russian soldiers, but later said that they were. A range of sanctions was imposed on Russia by the EU, the US and allies over this annexation. And these sanctions included economic sanctions, including restrictions on access to financial markets, an arms embargo, restrictions on the export of oil extraction technology, targeted sanctions against certain individuals, and diplomatic sanctions. And that includes the exclusion from the G8 and a point that I will return to a bit later, which was the suspension of voting rights in the Council of Europe. The Foreign Secretary has said, and I quote, "I condemn the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sebastopol 5 years ago. The UK will never recognise Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, and we will call on Russia to end their illegitimate control of the peninsula and their attempts to redraw the boundaries of Europe." Ambassador Jonathan Allen, who is the UK Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, has said, "Russia's aggression towards Ukraine is not limited to the Donbass and Crimea. Russia seeks to undermine Ukraine at every opportunity, supplying the Russian-backed separatists with weapons and calling illegitimate elections, all in breach of the Minsk agreement." And only this year, Lord Ahmed in the other place said, "Sanctions imposed alongside our international partners, including the US, in 2014, have had a coordinated impact on Russia by increasing economic pressure to change its Ukraine policy and sending a clear, united message that Russian aggression in Ukraine will not be tolerated. This impact has been strengthened by the continuation and maintenance of 2014 sanctions since their implementation. So there has been widespread condemnation from the UK on Russia's activities, and it is good to see this strong line continuing.
My honourable friend,
Of course I will.
I commend him for the beginning of his speech, which is absolutely superb. But does he agree with me that perhaps part of the problem for the Russian aggression and the boldness with which they have done this in the Ukraine has been the lack of proper and effective response when Russia moved into South Ossetia and Abkhazia when they did in Georgia?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point. There are many reasons that are given as to why Russia did this. One of them is that by keeping Ukraine at war, it prevents it from joining NATO, for example. And I think that is beyond being a conspiracy theory, but it is something that we ought to recognise. Now, the situation in the Council of Europe I will return to towards the end of my speech. On March the 20th, 2014, Russia organised a sham referendum in the Crimea. That referendum was followed by the so-called agreement on the accession of the Republic of Crimea to the Russian Federation on March the 18th, 2014. Voters were not given the chance to choose the status quo in the referendum, which was conducted in polling stations under armed guard. This violated Ukraine's constitution and international law, and 97%, it is claimed, had voted to join Russia. And according to Russian official results, this was on a turnout of 87%. But it is interesting that later, a member of the Russian Human Rights Council mistakenly posted the real election results, showing that only 55% had voted to join Russia on a turnout of 40%, and that is very significant. The UN General Assembly produced 2 resolutions, one of which I understand that we co-sponsored, and calling on states and international organisations not to recognise any change in Crimea's status, and affirmed the commitment of the United Nations to recognise Crimea as part of Ukraine. The referendum also violated, amongst other agreements, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances for Ukraine. This was an agreement whereby Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that were on its territory in exchange for independence and for undertakings given by Russia. There is no precise data on what the effect of this has had, but a quick calculation shows that due to the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia, Ukraine has been robbed of the following assets. 3.6% of GDP has gone. 4,000 enterprises have gone. 10% of the port infrastructure has gone. 80% oil and gas deposits have been taken, and 70% of potential natural gas deposits in the Black Sea have also been taken. So, of course.
Thank you very much for giving way. You paint a very bleak picture, but early on in your introduction, you mentioned sanctions applied on Russia by the United States, by European Union and other allies. How effective have these sanctions been? Do we have any measure of that?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and it's interesting because in the other place, Lord Ahmed said that the sanctions had been very good in sending a clear and united message that Russian aggression in Ukraine will not be tolerated. But in actual practice, I'm not sure that they've had that much effect. And, for example, the arms embargo Russia has been able to get around. I think the only one that has had some effect has been the depriving Russia of access to the financial markets, particularly in London and elsewhere. And I do think that that has had some impact on the state of Russia. But let me now turn to look at the impact of this annexation of Crimea on Ukraine. And first let me deal with the illegal imposition of Russian law. Contrary to its obligations as an occupying power under the Fourth Geneva Convention, Russia has imposed its legislation in the occupied territory of Crimea. What is extremely dangerous is that Russian laws have been applied retroactively to acts and events that took place in Crimea prior to occupation. So this is not a dry legal debate. It has severe implications for the people of Crimea. For example, the policy of automatic naturalization, which is when all Ukrainian citizens who remained on the occupied territory had forcibly imposed on them Russian citizenship, that is not something that is not part of the dry legal debate. That is a big change for them. Moreover, Russia's occupation and purported annexation of Crimea complicated the question of citizenship for children born after February 2014, since it is difficult for parents to register a child as a citizen with the Ukrainian authorities. 8 conscription campaigns of Crimean residents into the Russian Federation Armed Forces have been held since the beginning of the occupation. During the latest campaign, which ended in December 2018, approximately 2,800 men from Crimea were enlisted, bringing the overall number of Crimean conscripts to almost 15,000. As the draft evasion is punishable under Russian criminal law by up to 2 years in prison, Crimean citizens are de facto forced to enter the Russian armed forces. The atmosphere of fear, intimidation, physical and psychological pressure have forced about 35 to 40,000 Ukrainian citizens, including an enormous number of Crimean Tatars, to leave Crimea and settle in other areas of Ukraine. The US Department of State, in its human rights report issued in 2018, says that the actual number could be as high as 100,000, as many of them remain unregistered. And to replace those who left the peninsula, up to 1 million Russians have been brought in from Russia and resettled in Crimea. Religious freedom has also been compromised as a result of this. 38 parishes of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, administered by the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, have closed down in the occupied Crimea. Remaining in the peninsula are 8 parishes of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but they are constantly targeted by the occupying authorities since Russia seized control of the peninsula. And it is not just these individual churches. Russia has launched legal proceedings to seize the land, where the only cathedral under the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Crimea is located. And both mosques and indeed the Jewish community have been targeted as well. In March 2014, Reform Rabbi Mikhail Kapustin of Simferopol was forced to leave Crimea after denouncing Russian actions. His synagogue had been defaced by a swastika, and a month later, vandals defaced Sevastopol's monument to 4,200 Jews killed by the Nazis in July 1942. Russia has set out to systematically eliminate Crimean Tatar and the Ukrainian language and culture. No schools are now left in Crimea with a curriculum entirely in Ukrainian and Crimean languages. Contrary to the 2017 order of the International Court of Justice, which requests Russia to ensure the availability of education in the Ukrainian language, the number of children studying in Ukrainian has decreased from 14,000 in 2013-14 to 172 in the 2017-18 school year. Russia has banned the highest representative body of Crimean Tatars, the Mejlis. I will get it right eventually, under false allegations of extremist activity. And despite the clear meaning of the 2017 International Court of Justice order to refrain, pending the final decision in the case, from maintaining or imposing limitations on the ability of the Crimean Tatar community to conserve its representative institutions, 2 years have passed, and Russia still continues to maintain its ban. Members of the indigenous Crimean Tatar minority, many of whom have vocally opposed the Russian occupation, have faced particularly acute repression by the authorities. In 2018, 367 instances of the right to a fair trial were infringed. More than 90 persons, mostly Crimean Tatars, have been detained and or sentenced under politically motivated charges, with some being transferred into Russia across an internationally recognized border. And in detention centers, they are being mistreated and tortured as punishment or to extort confessions. On December the 12th, 2018, Russia detained an amputee, Crimean Tatar, Edem Bekirov. He has diabetes. He has 4 shunts in his heart. Since then, he has been denied urgently needed medical care. He has now got an infection in his open wound where his leg was amputated. He is not allowed to go outdoors. His sugar blood level and his blood pressure have all gone up. He sleeps in a sitting position, and Russian FSB rejects his alibi in favour of a secret witness, and recently his detention was extended until June. From 2014 to June the 30th, 2018, 42 persons were victims of enforced disappearances, including 27 ethnic Ukrainians and 9 Crimean Tatars. It is believed that Russian security forces kidnapped the individuals for opposing Russia's occupation to instill fear in the population and prevent dissent. And Russian occupation continues to deny access of international human rights monitors to Crimea in line with United Nations resolutions. The Ukrainian cultural heritage is also under threat. There is one very big World Heritage Landmark and 4 landmark sites which have already been submitted to UNESCO and are located in the occupied territory. And having illegally announced the right of ownership for 32 historical buildings of the Khan's Palace array, the Russian occupying power has undertaken an unprofessional and incompetent reconstruction. Now, I know that that may seem insignificant in comparison with the lives of the individual who were suffering from diabetes, but it has a personal association for me because I am a former archaeologist before I came into this house, and it is very sad to see this happening. And the removing of valuable cultural artifacts from Crimean museums to Russia is continuing. But this is nothing to the Russian militarization of the peninsula, which has continued at a pace. Russia has substantially reinforced and modernized its Crimean military land, its Crimean military air, and its naval components. The militarization of Crimea is a threat, not just to Ukraine, but to the whole European security. At any moment, it can provoke a military conflict in the Black Sea region with NATO. Of course, I would be delighted.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, a fellow member of the Council of Europe delegation. I've been to the Ukraine 3 times in the last few weeks to monitor the election process and was privileged to witness on Sunday the peaceful transfer of power and in many ways, in most people's eyes, a rather unexpected democratic change in the Ukraine. Can I ask my honourable friend, does he agree with me that that really is something to celebrate? And that there is clear evidence that the Ukrainian people are embracing the democratic path to change, and that the UK should, on this basis alone, the Ukraine is embracing democratic values. Should we not continue to fully support the country in its assertion of its territorial integrity?
I think my honourable friend, who I pay tribute to for her work with us on the Council of Europe, makes a very, very good point on this. It would be so easy for Ukraine when it is threatened with Russian annexation, with the military activity in the Donbass, to take a very restrictive attitude to the conduct of elections and what they can achieve. But it hasn't. It hasn't. It has had full democratic elections that have produced a startling result, a change result that I think we should, she is right, we should compliment Ukraine on, and we should do all that we can to support that in the future. Of course.
I'm grateful to my own friend, and he quite rightly sets out a litany of sad human rights abuses and cultural vandalism, not only in Crimea and Donbass, but we've heard of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia as well. On the point of the election of Volodymyr Zelensky, in his campaign, he said that he would not see Crimea exchanged for peace in Donbass. Does my honourable friend agree with me that he needs to hold fast to that commitment pre-election, and as he comes to become president in the next couple of weeks, he needs to be robust with Russia, along with Western partners, another commitment he made. While seeking peace, he should not be seeking peace at any cost.
I agree with my honourable friend. I think we've all been looking at the results of the Ukrainian elections with some degree of caution as to what the attitude of the new president will be. But I do agree with him that this is not a time to back down from the demands that have been made for the restoration of Crimea, for an end to the fighting in the Donbass. This is a time for using the allies that it has in order to keep pushing that point and to make that point very strongly. Now, since 2014, the Russian forces have increased the number of troops in occupied Crimea by 3 times. The armoured vehicles have been increased by 5 times. The artillery there has been increased by 10 times. The jets have been increased by 5 times. And the multiple launch rocket systems have been increased by 10 times. Most recently, it has deployed 4 battalions of S-400 Triumph missile systems in Crimea, and this allows Russia to cover all of the Black Sea, the Azov Sea area, and most of Ukraine. And the Russian Black Sea fleet can now fire in a single shot 86 caliber, or as they are known, Sizzler, nuclear-capable missiles able to reach not only Kiev, but other EU capitals. Of course.
The Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and can I say he's giving an amazing speech, a real grounding in the problems that are faced across the region from this annexation of Crimea. It's not just a problem for the Ukraine. As he said earlier, it's a problem for the whole of Europe. He's rightly limited the weapons increase there, but the real live fire risk is coming towards Europe in particular and attacking Ukraine on a regular basis from cyber attacks. The NotPetya attack cost the world economy 10 billion. Does he recognise that unless we also pay attention to the different sandboxing that is taking place, the testing out of cyber weapons that have been targeted on Ukraine, on its infrastructure, its airports, its utilities, its banks, they will turn on Europe, having been demonstrated to be lethal, and will start attacking us, particularly as the European elections loom?
I think the Honourable Lady makes a very valid point, and I do not underestimate the effect of Russian attacks in a cyber sphere, on not just on Ukraine but on the whole of the whole of Europe. I'm personally not sure what we can do about that, except to make sure that we are strong in resisting it, because I think she has highlighted a very key point, that it affects the whole of us. And once an attack has been launched on Ukraine, then it can affect the rest of Europe. In this situation, what are we to make of the actions of the Council of Europe, which have now produced a motion that makes it easier for Russia to return by not having the credentials of its members challenged? PACE, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, has not suspended Russia. The decision was taken by Russia since 2015 not to present credentials for its own delegation in response to voting restrictions placed upon them by PACE following the illegal annexation of Crimea. The UK is clear that a Russian return to PACE would be contingent on the withdrawal of all Russian military personnel and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, as well as an end to the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. And I would urge the Minister to reject, or at least to heavily modify, the recent recommendation from PACE, which is coming his way as part of the Committee of Ministers, and which liberalises the PACE approach to this. Of course. Andrew Smith.
My honourable friend is being very generous. Does he not agree with me that the credibility of PACE and indeed all the institutions of the Council of Europe is at stake here, and that it will be very difficult for bodies such as the Venice Commission to go into Ukraine and recommend legal reform if the Council of Europe is seen to give way to Russian threats and Russian threats to withdraw financial support for the institution.
I do agree with her. At the last meeting of the Council of Europe, I moved what seemed like countless amendments to try to make the report that had been produced much better. They were all, unfortunately, defeated, although I would like to pay great compliments here to one of our Ukrainian colleagues, Sergei Kirill, who led a brilliant campaign with us to be able to try to defeat them at various times during the council proceedings. But I agree with her that it does affect the credibility of the whole of the organisation.
Would my
of
friend
course.
allow me? Thank you, Mr. Davis. As President of the European Conservative Group, which Sergio Kirill is part of it, I would like to echo my honourable friend's sentiments that he did a phenomenal job. But also the Ukraine delegation in the Council, regardless of party, socialist, whatever they are a formidable bunch of characters who really do credit to their nation under the most difficult circumstances. And we have been, and certainly my honourable friend of Ribble Valley, who's not in his place at the moment, when we've been at IPU, where we've actually had to separate the Russians and the Ukrainians because of provocation, I think is remarkable the work they do. And I just would like to pay tribute, if I may, to him.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that tribute, and I agree with it. I think the Ukrainian delegation has been absolutely fantastic, and that's regardless of politics. They have all stood as one in the Council of Europe, and it has been a great pleasure to work with them. Let me just turn briefly to finish off with the situation in the Azov Sea. Stability remains elusive in eastern Ukraine, and Russia has moved to shore up its hold on Crimea. Russia has built a bridge across the Kerch Strait, connecting Crimea to Russia. On the 25th of November 2018, Russian border patrol ships attacked and seized 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels attempting to enter the Sea of Azov from the Black Sea through the Kerch Strait, in a move that looked designed to gain complete control of the Sea of Azov. In December, suspicions that Russia has nuclear arms in Crimea were reported. These developments suggest that while the conflict in the eastern mainland regions of Ukraine may be resolved, Russia does not intend to restore Ukrainian sovereignty over Crimea. And I am worried that succor may be given to the views which I heard coming out of various organisations that actually both sides are to blame in this conflict. They are not. This is naked Russian aggression. The bridge breaches Ukrainian sovereignty, and this is a particularly dangerous development which we need to condemn. All of those reasons were why the Secretary of State for Defence made a visit to Ukraine before Christmas, and why we sent a naval vessel to the area, not quite a harking back to gunboat diplomacy, but nevertheless a move that certainly sent a great deal of patriotism through some of our blood. It was meant to send a very clear signal to Russia that we will stand by Ukraine, rather than it being an act of further provocation. We intend to send, I understand, other Royal Naval ships to provide a more constant British presence. And to our Ukrainian friends, I say that we will support you, and I hope that you take that in the spirit in which it is intended. This is a terrible tale of a big country throwing its weight around to the detriment of a country which, as its role in the Council of Europe shows, is fully playing a part in Western culture while retaining its own identity. It is not a good situation. It has made Europe much more prone to instability and, sadly, to increased conflict. And I look forward to the Minister's comments and his continuing commitment to trying to ensure that Russia withdraws from Crimea.